Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today for today's session, which is entitled Governance Does Not Have to Be a Nasty Word. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. We'll probably have a few other people jump on the call as we go ahead, but definitely want to dive into things and get going right on time here at 1 o'clock. So again, thank you everybody for joining us. Welcome to today's session. Just want to take a couple seconds just to highlight some of the logistics for the session today. What you'll notice is on your screen you'll have a pop-up menu or a little dashboard that gives you the information about today's session. During the session, what you can do is you can raise your hand if you have a question. An alternative way that you can go about doing this is that there's actually a little section around questions. Feel free to type in any of the questions that you have there. And when we get to the Q&A section, then definitely we'll be running through some of those questions and try to answer those questions for you today. It is an interactive session. It is about having some collaboration here. So feel free to raise your hand or type in a question, and we'll make sure that we get to that in today's session anyway. Okay. So my name is Randy Whitcroft, and I'm with Syntapa, and we're very fortunate to have a number of folks joining us today to talk a bit more about governance. And fundamentally, the topic of governance is it doesn't need to be a nasty word. Governance is one of those types of topics that any organization that is doing anything with SharePoint, they recognize that there is a requirement for governance. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about a number of different topics. First off, I want to present some interesting data, some interesting market data, which will really kind of set the stage for today's presentation. Talk a bit more about SharePoint governance, and then I'm going to talk a bit more about SharePoint's governance plan. So in other words, what are some of the elements, some of the key stakeholders, the process that you go through. One of the things that I want to highlight here is that we're going to touch on a number of different areas as it relates to governance and the governance plan. By all means, this is a pretty meaty topic, so we're not going to cover off everything today and not going to be able to at least give you all the answers today. However, I want to at least give you the foundation around a number of the different elements as it relates to SharePoint governance, and then also point you towards a couple other resources. Obviously, from that point, we will have a question and answer section within the presentation where if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or ask questions in the chat menu like we had talked about, and then a quick wrap up and go from there. Okay. So let's take a look at really setting the stage for some of this. So, there's really some interesting data. Recently there was another Osterman research report that came out, Improving SharePoint Use and Governance, October 2012 report. Full credit to them, and the URL is there for you to take a look at this. I know some of the people on the line, I recognize some of the names, and I know that some of you have already taken a look at this report. But for those that haven't, just wanted to kind of recap some of this. So what they did is they went out to the market, talked to a number of clients that have implemented SharePoint or went down the road with SharePoint, and really started to gather some information for them. And here's a chart that really represents some of the findings that they got within that report. Some interesting stats to take out of this. Of the organizations surveyed, only 14% feel that they have met the user adoption expectations that were set out when SharePoint was first deployed. So in other words, very few of them feel that they've actually gotten a full user adoption, the full embracing by the users of the SharePoint system and the implementation that they've done. 33% of the respondents stated that, the C-level executives or, the CXO or again, C-level executives within the organization have provided enough buy-in and or sponsorship for it's been a major inhibitor as it relates to that. So in other words, 66% were probably bought in, but there's still remaining 33% that, they're just not buying into SharePoint. They're just not seeing the value of SharePoint and the implementation of SharePoint within their organization. It has nothing to do with the product, and we're going to talk a bit more about that, but it has more about how they went about actually implementing it, and governance being one of those key areas. 49% feel that end-user training and usage and their comfort level or their familiarity with SharePoint is a major inhibitor to fully leveraging the system that they've implemented. This is fairly high, and I think one of the things that Microsoft has done is they've went a long way to actually try to create a lot of the common look and feel that they've had in their other tools and their other technologies. However, there's still something underlying here because, again, 49% feel that the end user training and usage and that familiarity is not really hitting the mark. So out of that, if you start to drill that down even further, only about 1 in 5 organizations have an active governance plan for SharePoint. Now, when we start to talk about a mission-critical and sort of an enterprise-wide application like SharePoint, this is a huge risk for organizations not to have went through the proper process of really defining the governance and building out the proper governance plan. So let's take a moment just to talk a bit more about governance as a whole. You know what? The one thing that we found with a number of organizations is the fact that the term itself, governance, can often paint a bit of a picture for the users and all those involved. You know what? If you go back to the proper term of governance, you look it up in the dictionary. You know, all the elements around that. It is, you know, in essence, the concept about governing. So in other words, you know, making the rules for others to follow and creating sort of those checks and balances where you can measure people's performance and you can limit what they're able to do, that type of thing. So in many ways, you know what, the word governance itself actually goes against, you know what, the word of SharePoint, right? Because of the fact that, you know, SharePoint, the concept behind it is to create that sharing within the organization and to benefit from that collaboration and that sharing. Whereas governance is more about limiting and governing. So I think, you know, the only point here is recognize the fact that the word governance sometimes can be a bit of a nasty word, or at least paint some of that perception in people's minds, when the reality is it's not that nasty, but there is always that human element into there that you need to consider whenever you're looking to do a governance plan within your organization for your SharePoint implementation. Another challenge around that is the fact that there's no real standards or industry best practices as it relates to governance. Microsoft and a few others have provided some outlines as it relates to governance and as to what should be included, but there's very little as it relates to really helping you to understand how to go about doing SharePoint governance, how to build that plan, and how to make that happen. It's not like typical information technology standards like ITIL or some of the others out there. There's no real industry standards or best practices as it relates to governance, and it seems like everybody kind of does things a little bit differently. One of the things that we've found and interacting with a number of our clients and organizations that are doing work with SharePoint is that they often go down the road of doing, you know, implementing SharePoint and trying to build out a bit of governance around the organization, but what they're doing is they're lacking the proper stakeholder engagement and involvement. You know what, it's human instinct that, you know what, the more people feel like that they've been involved in the process, the more they feel like that they actually have their fingerprints on it, you know, the more opportunity you have for success, the greater likelihood you have for success. So a lot of organizations, right or wrong, typically will go down the road of trying to do some of this, setting out the rules and the policies and everything else like that, without fully engaging with the proper stakeholders and involving them throughout the process. And we're going to touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. Another area that we found that a lot of organizations challenges, or you know, they have challenges as it relates to SharePoint implementation, is the fact that, you know what, they actually turn around and they provide SharePoint to the wrong group and ask them to go ahead and implement it within the organization. We'll touch on this a little bit later, but I think the biggest concept around this is the fact that SharePoint is a platform, not a product. So if you start to think about it as a platform, it requires certain types of processes, like properly gathering requirements, configuration management, you know, proper testing, QA processes, that type of thing, which aren't necessarily always available or inherent within the minds of certain organizations or departments within the organization. Let's take IT, for example. The IT department is fantastic about making technologies work. They, you know what, they take a product, they integrate it, they make it work seamlessly within your environment. However, they're not used to what I'll call more traditional software development best practices around gathering user requirements, around creating, configuration management elements or testing processes, that type of thing. So this is one of the other areas where a lot of organizations, they struggle because they're looking towards the wrong group in order to be able to implement this. And this often comes back to the core, the root cause of all this is because of the fact that they're viewing SharePoint as a product, not a platform. One of the other areas out of this that we found some challenges with organizations is that their governance, when they go down the road to doing governance, it's not connected to the business goals or how the business operates. So again, it comes back to really the stakeholder involvement, but engaging with the business and the users to truly understand what do they do throughout the day, how do they use the tool, what do they need from the tool in order to be able to better do their job. So, and often without doing that, again, they roll out a solution that is not truly connected to the business, its goals, or its overall operations and how it works. The plan does not always cover all the key elements. So, again, coming back to no standards or best practices, what we found is that, there are organizations that have went down the road of trying to do a governance plan, trying to do governance, but they miss certain key elements within the governance plan that become vital. And obviously the ripple effect of that is that they start to run into issues later on down the road. And then I think the last thing around SharePoint governance and the SharePoint governance plan is it's not kept up to date. This has to be treated and viewed as a living document. It's not a one-time exercise. And again, we'll touch on that a little bit later on in the presentation itself. So one of the key things that I mentioned earlier is the fact that SharePoint is a platform, not a product. The best way to really sort of, the analogy that we often use around that is the fact that SharePoint, think about SharePoint really as that blank canvas. That canvas where, ultimately, when you take it out of the package, you install the solution itself, but in many ways it's that blank canvas. And based upon that, SharePoint has the ability to really become that masterpiece. So in other words, that solution that fully integrates your team, allows collaboration, allows information sharing and information management across the organization, has a ton of different business benefits, including, cost savings, increased efficiencies, all these different elements. So it can truly be that masterpiece. However, the flip side of that is the fact that it can be not so much of a masterpiece. And I think part of that is the fact that, again, it can be anything in between. And so part of that is the fact that SharePoint has the ability that as soon as you install it, you can turn around and actually start to build out team sites within a matter of minutes. And so, but without truly taking the time to envision what that masterpiece is going to look like and envision what you want that end result to be, it may not actually turn out to be the masterpiece that you're hoping for, but something a little less less attractive, I guess, is the best way to do it. I'm trying to think of the right term as it relates to artwork anyway. So let's talk about SharePoint governance as a whole. So SharePoint governance really is a plan and a guide on how to best use and manage SharePoint within your organization. Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to. Now, if you start to drill that down a little bit further, what it does is it really comprises of a number of certain IT application information management rules and processes which are to be applied to ensure the system operates properly, provides the most value to both the users as well as the organization as a whole. And specifically what it does is it creates a set of policies, roles, the responsibilities, and the processes that guides and manages how the organization's operational divisions, IT, and end users cooperate to conduct business operations to achieve the business goals using SharePoint. I know it's a little bit wordy, but the biggest thing out of that is that it's important for you to truly understand that SharePoint isn't, SharePoint governance isn't necessarily about governing and holding somebody, putting the screws on an organization or the users to be able to do something a certain way. However, there are a certain set of policies and as it relates to, where are you going to store the information? How is it archived? Who is actually going to take ownership for doing the backups and the disaster recovery? Who's responsible for, at any time you want to do an enhancement to the system, that type of thing. And then also as it relates to processes. So in other words, yes, we talked about backup, disaster recovery, some of those different elements, and again, we'll touch on a little bit later, but what are the processes in order to be able to handle change requests? So somebody wants to now add a brand new team site, or they want to add a new library, or they want to add a new set of capability to the system. What's a process that you go through in order to be able to decide, is this appropriate for the organization? And how does this relate back to the organization and how we do business and how we achieve our business goals? So the SharePoint governance plan as a whole is broken out into a number of sort of key components. And again, we're not going to be able to touch on every single aspect of it today, but what I'm going to do is at the presentation, I'll point you towards obviously some of the Microsoft solutions that are available, or the resources rather that are available for you to be able to actually learn a bit more about SharePoint governance, some of the key elements that should be included within the plan itself. But at a high level, it's broken into three different sort of sections. So first off, information technology. So obviously SharePoint is a technology itself. So as it relates to the IT side of things, so how are you going to define security for SharePoint? And security can be everything from who has access to certain team sites to who has access to certain libraries, certain files, that type of thing. And often what we do is when we engage with organizations, we'll take a look at things like their Active Directory, their Active Directory groups, that type of thing, in order to be able to begin to isolate what some of those groups are, as well as we would actually want to leverage a lot of those policies and everything else, and so that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel as it relates to security policies, that type of thing. Data protection. So how's the data going to be protected itself? So the customization policy. So in other words, you want to add a new team site. You want to do some branding. You want to change the look and feel. How is the solution going to be customized itself? Deployment of the solution. Who's going to deploy it? What are the phases of the deployment? And then what's the site lifecycle management? So, one of the things about technology is it's great because of the fact that, constantly evolving as obviously the business and the world changes around us, but also, that it can also be a bit of a challenge as well because of the fact that, security breaches, that type of thing, there may be often different updates that are coming to SharePoint. So based upon those updates or even to, the Microsoft Office technologies, if you have those integrated, any of those different elements. So exactly how are you going to handle the life cycle of the system itself? How are you going to handle the life cycle of the site? How are you going to actually determine when to archive the materials, where to archive them, that type of thing? Asset classification. So in other words, and how are you going to classify the information within the system? And then the quotas, the data limits. So are you going to limit the types of data that people are going to store there? Are they going to store massive files, media files, that type of thing? Or is it just going to be reserved for things like documents or spreadsheets, that type of thing? And then obviously setting quotas based upon some of those different requirements. Application management. So this is more about, again, tying into information technology. It's more about, the physical and how SharePoint operates within the organization and how you manage it within the organization. The application management is more about SharePoint itself. So in other words, how are you going to handle enhancements? How are they going to be worked throughout the organization? How are you going to brand it as it relates to, if you want to keep the common look and feel across the organization? Version control. How are you going to handle that when you all of a sudden want to roll out an enhancement, roll out a new capability within the system? How are you going to actually version control SharePoint itself and everything that you built within that? And again, the customization policies. So as it relates to how are you actually, what are you actually allowed to customize as a user, as an IT person, as an administrator within the system itself? in order to be able to make sure that you don't get too off kilter and things don't start to sprawl all over the place. Information management. So in other words, what's the architecture of SharePoint itself? So what's the structure of your SharePoint site and your overall site? Are you going to be broken down into team sites that are lined up based upon the different, sort of operational divisions within your organization? So in other words, will you have an HR site? Will you have a finance site? Will you have a sales business development site? That type of thing. So that architecture, and then taking it down to the next level, based upon that, what are some of the common libraries that you need to have? The list, the content types. All these things need to be considered as part of the SharePoint governance plan. Types of information that you're storing in there. And then probably one of the biggest ones is search. So one of the things that we often find with a lot of organizations is the fact that, they have trouble really starting to decide, okay, I want to move forward with SharePoint. At what point do we start to do this? So in other words, do we start to implement only new projects and new information from this point moving forward? If that's the case, then obviously, how are you going to set up search in order to be able to make sure that you don't lose all of your legacy data, all of your legacy information that may be sitting in network folders or any type of storage, network storage, that type of thing? You want to be able to get access to it. So again, that becomes part of the foundation for search and how you handle search within sort of the information management side of the governance plan. From the next thing that you need to really think about is, from the governance perspective, is one of the key elements that I touched on earlier, and I think we, wanted to really do a little bit further, is really about, the stakeholders and engaging the proper stakeholders as part of the SharePoint governance plan. So again, I touched on this a little bit earlier in the fact that, people are more likely to embrace something that they've actually had input within. So in other words, if they've been involved throughout the process, then chances are they're going to be much more adopting of the system as a whole. But in order to be able to get the executive buy-in for SharePoint and the implementation and everything else as it relates to the governance plan, it's absolutely vital that you engage with the executives as part of that process. Part of that engagement is making sure that you're building the tool and you're building SharePoint and your SharePoint implementation to help you do business, to meet your business goals and not the other way around. So in other words, your business should not be rotating around SharePoint and how to use SharePoint, but it truly is the other way around. And that capability is fully there within SharePoint. Stakeholders, and part of that is that there's probably a number of different stakeholders, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in one of the upcoming slides and some of the people that you want to engage as part of that process. But understand that when you're gathering those stakeholder requirements, what you need to be able to do is understand how they're doing their job today. One of the key elements around that is take the time to truly understand how they're measured within the organization. So in other words, not only what they do, but how are they actually measured to be able to say, yes, they're doing their job well, they're not doing their job well, or what are some of the metrics that they use in order to be able to effectively do their job. And the key point behind all this is simply, if it's not measured, it does not matter. So rather than focusing on trying to create a repository where everybody can dump their dump a bunch of articles, and if they ever want to come back and see them, then they're there. Focus on things such as, okay, what enhancements, what workflows can I build into SharePoint that will help our executives in order to be able to get the data that they need in order to be able to do their job and help them drive the business and manage the business. What capabilities can I build within SharePoint that will allow the users to be able to save time throughout the day in gathering the information that they're trying to gather? Also understand things like, are they actually contributors of the information, or are they just consumers of the information? So those are the types of things that you need to flush out as part of really that governance plan and that process to truly understand, okay, so based upon here's how people work or the end users work or the types of data that executives want to get out of the system, that then leads to exactly how the overall system should be architected, rolled out, and embraced ultimately by the users themselves. And again, it's absolutely vital that you incorporate and you engage those users as part of this process. So we come back to those key stats we talked about earlier at the beginning of the presentation about some of the industry stats. Well, you know what? If you're driving and you're engaging those executives to understand, helping them to meet their goals and helping them to help the business to achieve its goals, chances are those users or those executives are going to buy in much more because they see the value of the system. You're going to have much greater user adoption by taking the time to actually provide value for them and throughout the system in order to be able to help them save a bit of time throughout the day, easily find the information that they need to do, to be able to automate some of this through workflows, that type of thing. That's what drives the user adoption throughout this process. And that's why these stakeholder engagements and interviews and requirements gathering is absolutely vital. So those are kind of the key elements within sort of a governance plan. And I think, what we're going to do now is we're going to dive a little bit deeper into, so how do you actually go about doing a SharePoint governance plan? And we're going to talk, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on that here in a second. But I think, fundamentally, right out of the gate, there's a couple of things that you need to think about, and I think actually make some decisions on right out of the gate. First off, fundamentally, I think you need to make a decision, should you do it yourself or should you outsource or contract somebody else to do this? This comes back to the 80-20 rule, right? So part of that 80-20 rule or sort of the implementation of the 80-20 percentage is one where, if you can get 80% of the way there and then all you have to do is turn around and actually modify it or configure it and do that last 20% in order to be able to meet your needs, what type of value does that provide for you? And I think, when you're starting to make these types of decisions, start to consider things like, again, do you actually have the resources available internally that understand what I'll call more the development best practices as it relates to, trying to uncover user requirements and translate those into the technical requirements? Do you have the in-house understanding as it relates to how to manage and actually control different versions and do configuration management of the system? Do you have the in-house resources to actually go out and interview the people and like I said, gather some of those requirements and use some of those development best practices? The other aspect to consider is the time and effort required in order to be able to do this. So maybe you do have some good resources internally that are able to go out and actually gather the proper user requirements, sit with the executives in order to be able to better understand their vision for the system, but also the capabilities and the functionality that they want to see through that. However, there is a cost for that distraction as well. So if somebody takes on this project, right or wrong, this cannot be a part-time project. There needs to be some focus on that. And because of the fact that there's going to be some of that focus, ultimately the ripple effect is the fact that there's going to be some distraction there as well. Not trying to lead you one way or another, but I think it's absolutely key that you take the time to invest in that decision to begin with, because based upon that, it's either going to speed up the process and get you to where you need to be quicker, or it's ultimately you're going to find yourself, 2, 3, 4 weeks or even months later down the road and still not being able to actually be able to get what you need to do. So let's talk a bit more about the SharePoint plan itself. And so there's a couple of different elements around this. And as it relates to the SharePoint plan, the first thing that you need to do is obviously begin to build out what we call the governance team. So if you check out some of the Microsoft materials and some of the other materials, they'll call it a committee, Microsoft committee, or a governance committee rather, or anything else like that. So it doesn't, it doesn't necessarily matter about the term that you use, but we find that, the governance team is one that's a little more representative of what you're trying to accomplish within this. On the governance team, you want to make sure that you have representation from all the key sort of areas of your business. Some of the key ones that you want to make sure included in this process is obviously information technology. They're the ones that are actually going to be installing the technology. They're the ones that are going to understand a bit more about your current processes as it relates to backup, disaster recovery, all those different things. User representative. One of the key elements here is the fact that you don't have to necessarily interview every single user within the organization. But what you want to do here is look for what I'll call more the vocal, or the ones that carry a lot of influence amongst the user community. Gather them and make them part of the governance team as you go through this. You'll be surprised as to the type of impact that will have, because of the fact that that starts to play out into things like the water cooler talk and some of these different elements where the word starts to spread, and the fact that, again, the user requirements are definitely being heard and considered and integrated into the overall plan and the implementation. The other areas that you want to consider are the line of business leaders. So, you want to pull out key elements of the organization and the key elements of what the organization does, and make sure that the leaders from those key areas are included as part of the governance team. They may not have to attend every single meeting, but they need to be involved in the process as part of that team. So in other words, if you're building widgets, part of that is that you may want to make sure that you include somebody from manufacturing. You want to include somebody from sales. You want to include somebody from finance. You may want to include somebody from human resources or legal, that type of thing. So identify the key elements of the business and what your business does, and make sure that you're incorporating those key people from those different lines of business into the overall process. Compliance. So here is one of the biggest areas. One of the biggest advantages of a SharePoint environment is the ability that it provides you as it relates to being able to meet regulatory requirements, meet audit requirements, that type of thing. So if you have any type of compliance, or particularly if you have any type of compliance officers or people within your organization that are focused on compliance, it's absolutely vital that they're part of the process, because they're going to be the ones that are actually going to represent as it relates to archiving requirements, meeting certain elements as it relates to if you're getting any funding from more outside organizations, government entities, that type of thing. What do you need to do as part of that funding process in order to be able to get it? So they need to be involved in that process. Information management. Often what you'll do is if you take a look around, they're often, even though they may not necessarily have the title, they're the people that are focused on really trying to create that order within your system as it relates to the amount of information. What are the processes that you go through as it relates to getting approvals, those types of things? So anybody that's focused on really that information management within the organization, then you're going to want to include them as part of the overall governance team. Executives, we've talked a lot about that one coming up to this point, so I'm not going to beat on that one too much further, other than the fact of, once again, reiterating that, having some of those key executives, particularly those influencing ones, as part of the governance team, it allows them to make sure that they're involved. And not only that, it allows them to be able to make sure that, the system and the governance and how it works and how it operates is representative of the vision that they have for the overall organization. So the next step in this process is obviously going out and gathering those requirements. So what we typically do, and what we found out of that is that, once you've identified some of the people that are on the team, then as a governance team, you turn around and you say, okay, these are the people that we want to engage as part of this process to better understand the requirements, how they're doing their job, what information they need access to, what are the different elements that they need to get from the system, but also what ultimately can we do to make the system, to make it so that we're getting the most value from it the quickest. And part of that is obviously the requirements gathering process. So we talk about executives and users, but But part of that process is that, reach out to them and just simply set the stage with them, saying, we're moving down the road with SharePoint. We're moving down the road with an enterprise-wide information management system. Simply want to spend a bit of time to get to know what is it that you do on a daily basis. I want to, what does a typical day look like for you? And I'll spend for no more than probably about an hour to begin with as it relates to that. And when you engage with those clients, what you want to do, or those users rather, or those stakeholders, what you want to do is understand how are they using things such as email, okay? So are they using it, and within email, how are they actually managing their email? So in other words, are they archiving it locally? What happens if they need to find an email? How do they go about doing that? How are they actually storing the documents that are happening within the email itself? Anything that comes externally. What are some of the workflows that they do throughout the day? So in other words, what are some of the key documents? What are some of the key spreadsheets, the key information that they use throughout the day in order to be able to do their job? How exactly are they using it? Again, I come back to what I talked about earlier. Are they producing information or are they consuming information? So in other words, are they just running reports in order to be able to get data, or are they actually producing and gathering information and putting it out in a report that they're sending it off to the executives? There's many different ways to go about that, but take the time to actually walk in their shoes and ask them, simply put, what does a typical day look like for you? How are you using different tools? How are you using Microsoft tools, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all the different elements? And be sure to write those down and understand exactly how that's being done. Once you've gathered some of those requirements, then it's time to turn around and go back to the governance team and start to designate sort of the different areas that need to be hashed out as it relates to the proper governance plan. And we touched on some of those key elements earlier around from an information technology perspective. So how exactly, what exactly is SharePoint are we going to implement? Okay, what capabilities are we going to implement there? Are we just going to implement, some of the core capabilities, or are we going to incorporate some of the social capabilities in there? How are we going to manage things like wikis or discussion boards, or again, the social aspects of the solution? How are we actually going to phase it out? How are we going to? Is it going to be an iterative process as it relates to rolling it out to the different line of businesses? So in other words, are we going to do, let's say, sales first and then HR in the second wave? How exactly are you going to do that? By the way, how are you going to test the different elements within that? So in other words, how are you going to, as you start to build out your SharePoint environment and you start to build out capability within that, how are you actually going to go through testing of that solution before actually rolling it out? Now, how are you, all of a sudden there's a new patch that's come out from Microsoft. How are you going to test that patch? How are you going to back up all your information? Does it become part of the regular backup schedule? That type of thing. So these are all key elements that you need to work out to really manage the information technology or the technology side of the SharePoint implementation. Then from the application standpoint, again, we touched on some of those elements earlier, but you know what? How are we going to brand it? Is it going to be branded with our logo, or is it going to, are we going to integrate it into the current look and feel of our website or our external website? How exactly is this going to be done? How are we going to manage things like enhancements? How are we going to manage new capabilities in there? How are we going to allow people? Are we going to allow people to turn around and create new sites or new elements within that? Or are we going to just allow them to create new conversations on a discussion board or wiki? Those types of things. All these things need to be incorporated into that, but what's driving all that are the user requirements that you gathered in the previous step, okay? So again, I think what you need to focus on is, as you're building out that governance plan, focus on the elements of the SharePoint implementation that are going to drive the highest value to the users and to the organization as a whole. Prioritize it that way. Then what happens is then you have more likelihood for not only the users but the executives and everybody involved to embrace it much more. Sandbox environment. So once you've got the governance plan, documented and sort of that first iteration, create the sandbox environment. You know what? SharePoint, right or wrong, is one of those technologies that, you can do a lot with it. However, it often doesn't like change. And And what I mean by that is fundamental change to the technology itself. So in other words, if you have a certain site structure that you want to lay out within the organization, let's say to map your current line of businesses within the organization, to turn around and all of a sudden change that where, it's, different team site based upon, key topics that are, important that month within the organization. SharePoint does not handle that properly, and it does not handle it well. So part of that is the fact that we always encourage that you take the time to invest into making sure that you've got that sandbox environment where you can actually test things out as things change, but also you can test out the environment. You can make it so that it really becomes that testing environment for anything that you want to do to it before actually rolling it out to the users. One of the biggest mistakes that you can make is rolling something out to the users and them not being able to see where it's available when they need it. If there's a lot of downtime with the system, that is going to erode basically your user adoption quicker than most other things because of the fact that they're ultimately just going to give up and not go back to it again. So this is why the sandbox, the testing, the pre-production, or the prototype environment is absolutely vital in order to be able to do that. So roll it out there and then actually start to deploy to a certain set of users. You may want to have a phased deployment process where, again, you may iteratively through different lines of businesses or based upon different offices within the organization, that type of thing. So, but focus on the deployment to a certain set of users, work out more of the bugs before you actually go full production. But then make sure that you have that deployment model down fully. Training. This is probably one of the biggest areas. This is the fact that, we talked earlier about one of those stats where, when users aren't, they're not embracing the look and feel, that comfort level or that familiarity with SharePoint. Well, first off, you may focus in on tool training as it relates to being able to use a SharePoint system. But fundamentally, do not miss out the opportunity to actually implement and train them on the proper governance. What we've found with a lot of clients is because of the fact that Microsoft has done a great job of trying to create that common look and feel across the products, it's not as much about tool training as it is about more what we'll call the governance training, which is, okay, so when I have this document come in, where do I put it? How do I handle it? Where, what are the different libraries? So what information goes into that library? So in other words, I want to now do everything all the way down to, I want to do a vacation request. How does that happen? So you go into a particular calendar and you fill out the requirement and you inform them, you train them on the workflow behind that. So don't downplay the importance of governance as part of that end user training. They cannot follow, they cannot jump in and actually help to create the system that you're looking to create if they don't fully understand what's expected of them. Okay, so again, make sure that governance is part of that overall process. And then obviously when it's out there, maintain the system itself. And then, as you look to do enhancements, as you look to make changes within the system itself, this is where it all starts to rotate around and go from there. Somebody wants that they have an idea as to how they want to enhance basically the SharePoint system itself. You know what? That should actually be communicated and then brought up by with the governance team, for the governance team to talk about that. Then somebody from the governance team turns around and goes out and gathers some requirements from the users to better understand, okay, well, with this particular enhancement, what exactly do you need? And then obviously based upon that, the governance plan is then updated. So if you're to look at really the fundamental elements as it relates to a SharePoint deployment, most of the keys to success, what's going to determine the success of your overall implementation really is taking place in these front three areas as part of that process. Making sure that you've got a good team, a good representation across the organization, gathering the requirements from your executives and your users, and then making sure that you build it into the plan. Plan the work the plan. And then obviously make sure that you're constantly, the governance plan doesn't turn around and become a dust collector on the shelf somewhere. Make sure it's updated. Make sure people refer to it. Make sure that you're using it on a regular basis. So just starting to kind of wrap up here a little bit, and so there's a couple of different sort of elements that I want to highlight that are good for you, that if you're starting down the road as it relates to SharePoint governance, here's some great areas that you want to actually touch on. So first off, Microsoft actually has done a great job of really creating some good foundational information as it relates to governance. You know what, they've created some information on getting started, IT governance, application management, information management, adoption, user training. There's the URL for you there. Now, one of the key things about it is what we've noticed is the fact that Microsoft, again, has done a great job of really creating that information as it relates to, so what exactly is SharePoint governance? What is included in SharePoint governance, and some of the key elements that you want to include within that. But you know what, where it starts to break down is that there's not a lot of information that gives you really that hands-on training or capability as to how to go about doing SharePoint governance. And what I mean by that is there's not much there as it relates to helping you do things like end-user interviews or executive interviews or stakeholder requirements gathering, that type of thing. One of the key elements that we're releasing right now is what we call a quick start package, which fundamentally through presentations, through recordings, and then also through a set of repeatable materials you can use in order to be able to do, you know, really that governance capability within your organization. That is going to be released within the next 30 days. If it's something that you are interested in learning a bit more about, or if you'd like to actually take advantage of getting sort of that pre-release view of some of this information, you know, obviously we'd love to have your feedback as part of that process. So feel free to reach out to us using some of the information that we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. Okay, so on that note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of the questions here. By all means, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or type them in on the questions area. I do see a couple of the questions that popped up through the presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on them, and then obviously if you have anything, feel free to raise your hand or by all means, like I said, type out your question in the questions area, the dialog box. So one of the questions is, okay, it's about how best to get executive buy-in for SharePoint implementation. And I think, you know, that, you know, one of the things that we talked about earlier was, you know, when it comes to that executive buy-in, it's about, number one, sort of three different elements, and I think that you need to make sure that you consider as part of this process. So first off, you know what, get them engaged, okay? So don't be afraid to get them engaged as part of the process. But the thing is, but also get them, get them to the point where they actually become a stakeholder in the process, and they actually become involved in the process. So don't, as much as you can, to get them engaged as part of the process, get them not necessarily engaged where they just keep their requirements, but actually get them as part of the process. I hope I'm explaining this properly, but this is where things such as, for example, the having them as part of that team, you know, the stakeholder team or the SharePoint governance team that you're building, have them as part of that. Number two is what's in it for me. Always remember, like anything else, you need to communicate what's in it for me. So help them understand how SharePoint implementation is going to allow them to be able to get access to the information that they need quicker, for example. Show them how it's going to make their job easier. Help them understand that how this is going to help the organization as a whole in order to be able to meet their overall business goals. Okay, so help them actually understand those elements. Help them connect those dots. And then obviously you're much more likely to not only get the buy-in, but the involvement through that process. And I think that those are key differentiators that you need to keep in mind. Great question. Thank you. Another question here is, how many end users should you interview as part of this process? What a great question. And I think, you know what, so you know, part of the challenge that you need to understand as part of the requirements gathering is that you need to recognize the fact that, you know what, fundamentally, it can't be everything to everybody. So part of that is that, you know what, if you're to pick a number, I would not want to go any more than probably about 5 of those end users. But what you want to do is you want to get a cross-section of those. So different end users from different parts of the organization, different line of business, and make sure that you at least have one or two sort of end user representatives from those different areas. And then I think one of the key elements around that is coming back to really that governance team that you built by making sure that you have an influential or a vocal member there. I was part of that team that is there representing the end user community. I think will go a long way. But don't pull your hair out. Don't get frustrated. Don't think that you got to interview every single person, because it's absolutely not necessary. Just make sure that you choose the ones that you do interview. They're the ones that have influence and obviously can highlight really the benefits of the solution. Okay. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading this other one. I was trying to scroll through there and it changed the screen. Let me see. Okay. I've seen governance documents and guidelines, but they mostly seem to apply to large organizations. How about small ones with few resources? Great question. And I think that, and that seems to be, and even though that, they're talking about the large organizations, and often they do have the large resources. In the smaller based organizations, part of that is that, I think what you need to think about is that, a lot of the core principles around that remain the same. And so what I mean by that is so, for example, maybe things such as your backup and disaster recovery process is not as important, or, having to have an approval process in order to be able to do changes to the system is not as important. But always remember the fundamental core things that are important, and they can still be applied to any size of organization. So what I mean by that is, first off, start out, okay, what is it that the organization does? What are the goals? What is it that you produce? Okay? And then based upon that, what are some of the key metrics that the organization uses to define success? Beautiful. So there's one data point. Next data point is, okay, users. What are some of the ways that the users are using their email? They're using Word documents or Excel documents or any of the Microsoft technologies. How are they doing their job? Okay? If you can at least start out with engaging them in order to be able to understand some of those key elements, and then what you do is, based upon that, you then start to flush out things such as, at least some rules around, okay, listen, guys, I don't want everybody going out and creating brand new team sites on their own. Or at least building it into there so that there's at least a bit of a check and balance to say, okay, yeah, we don't want everybody doing this. It now has to go through one person to send a quick email over here. And I find that, you're probably about 75 to 80% of the way there. The only other thing that I will highlight is that, that's one of the main reasons that, and I'm sorry for kind of the shameless plug here, but this is one of the reasons why we'd be creating the Quick Start packages, because we know that, in some of the larger organizations, they've got the resources, they've got the capabilities internally in order to be able to do this, but there's a ton of, smaller to medium-sized organizations that don't have the resources, don't have the information, what have you, in order to be able to do proper SharePoint governance. So our goal out of that is really to give you all the tools that you need in order to be able to do that, including instruction on how to go about doing some of the interviews, the types of questioning that you need to do, that types of things as well. Okay? So hopefully that's answered your question anyway. Okay. So there's, I'm just looking through here. So that seems to be most of the questions that have popped up on sort of the question box here. If anybody else has any other questions before we move on to the next slide, then feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Nobody? Okay. So what I'm going to do then is let me just move on to the next slide. I will come back and check the question dialog box again here before we go, see if I've missed anything. But I just want to quickly summarize a few things for you. So first off, governance is not a nasty word, okay? Even though governance may paint a mental picture for people, the fact of the matter is that governance is actually one of the highest impact activities that you can take to increase the chance of a successful SharePoint implementation. Okay, so call it governance, call it best practices, call it requirements gathering, call it, whatever you want to call it. So don't forget that there is that human element in there. And if you get the sense that governance itself and the word governance scares people or at least intimidates people, change it to whatever you need to change it to. But fundamentally understand that governance, the interpretation of that by some people may seem to be nasty, but as it relates to what's involved in the governance plan and the activities that you do throughout that, nothing will have a much larger impact on the overall success of your SharePoint implementation than by doing one, no matter what you call it, okay? Number two is SharePoint is not a product. I just want to reiterate that over and over again, the fact that, it's a platform. If you treat it like a product, what's going to happen is you're going to take it, you're going to turn around, rip the, in essence, rip the shrink wrap off, install it, and then sit there and say, okay, now what, okay? Understand it's a platform. It can be as much or as little as you want it to be, but you need to recognize that it's a platform, okay? Engage with your executives and users as part of the process. Missing this step, I can guarantee you will have a direct impact on the overall user adoption and success of the project. You don't do it, you're going to run into problems because people they're not going to embrace it. If they don't embrace it, it just ends up on a shelf somewhere collecting dust, okay? Get help if you need it. It takes a different mindset in order to be able to engage with stakeholders to gather some of those requirements, that type of thing. And even if you don't want to necessarily outsource it and have an outside firm do it for you, you know what? Go out and get some of the help as it relates to at least exploring some of the information that's on the TechNet site. Give us a call. I'm more than happy to send you some of the information that we've got that may be able to help you out. And remember, it's not a one-time exercise. You need to update this regularly. Okay? So just one quick slide, or actually two, about Syntapa. Our background, just so you understand, we're coming to you with experience around this topic, is the fact that, fundamentally, we've been around since '84, and our focus is really about building those best-of-breed systems that provide that integrated solution to provide those real business requirements. And SharePoint being a good foundation and one of the main foundations for that. We've won a number of awards through Microsoft, and based upon client projects, what we've done is we've actually built a number of repeatable components that you can easily implement in order to be able to reduce those development costs and satisfy those real business requirements. Just a bit of background, some of our clients, these are just some of the ones that we work with and continue to work with on a regular basis. California Nurses, we've done a bunch of work with them. Royal College of Dental Surgeons of Ontario, Investment Industry Regulatory Organization. So, any type of, fundamentally, any organization that needs to manage a number of sort of clients, and they need to manage a number of different documents or content, and we can help you out through some of the work that we've done. And if you have any type of regulatory requirements, we can help you out even further based upon some of the work that we've already done as well. Okay. So on that note, what I'm going to do is I don't see any other questions that have popped up over the last couple minutes. So by all means, feel free to reach out to me or reach out to us if you have any questions, concerns, if we can ever be of assistance anyway. But I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully you received value from today's session. And by all means, we are just a phone call or an email away. So if we can help in any way, then please let us know. Thank you again for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.